first of all, the name of the disorder has changed, and the name is now Autism Spectrum Disorder.
Okay.
In the past, it used to be autistic disorder. Up to this point, there were essentially 3 different or 5 different diagnoses that were placed under the spectrum.
Okay.
So actually, the way that it is currently is that the chapter heading was pervasive developmental disorders. Essentially, that means disorders that are, cause delays or problems in more than one area. They're pervasive. And the 3 main ones that we were dealing with were autistic disorder, and then Asperger's disorder, and then pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified.
Right.
And so now with the new DSM, everything has been merged, and it is now called Autism Spectrum Disorder, one name.
Okay.
So what you have on the screen, I think, is basically going through the first portion. You'll see autistic disorder, and with autistic disorder, or what we call autism, there had to be a total of 6 or more symptoms. The symptoms would have had to been evident before the age of 3. And just very quickly, kind of the symptoms were in the areas of social deficit, communication deficits, and what we call stereotypic repetitive behaviors. And I've given a few examples of what would be considered a social deficit. For instance, if the child doesn't have eye contact, or the child doesn't share or show. And that's, in behavioral terminology, that's called tacting. Tacting means, how you've seen little kids and they will just sort of make an art thing project and then just come to mom or dad and show it. Yeah. And that is, or like if they're in the car, for instance, and they'll see, a fire engine, and they'll be like, fire engine or truck or whatever, and all they're doing is showing it or sharing minds, essentially. And that's a very important feature or symptom, because it's the very first example, or not really the first, but the very most obvious early example of joint attention. So that means the child who shows you something already has the understanding that your mind and that his mind are separate minds. Yeah. And so you don't know what I'm thinking about, but here it is, I kind of want to show this to you, or there it is, I want you to see that. And that's kind of like join your mind with mine. Look at what I'm looking at. And that is the, I guess, first most obvious sign of joint attention or perspective taking theory of mind. So that's a very important key feature. So if a child is not doing that, that's a red flag. Okay. And then, of course, emotional reciprocity is another key feature of the social deficit. These are children who don't really react if they're hurt, or if they need comfort, or if they see another person hurt, or that sort of thing. Now, in the social deficit area, you do need 2 symptoms. This is the current status. You need to have 2 at least in that area.
You could have more,
but in
order to qualify, you have to have at least 2.
At least 2, correct. In communication deficits, the areas that we look at are language, obviously, and that's the most common. Most of the kids that I see come in because they have a delay in language. And then pretend play is considered a communication, or up to this point, considered a communication deficit. So the child is not really doing any pretend play. And pretend play has to do with using sort of imaginary objects to perform various things. Like an early sign of that would be picking up a toy telephone, let's say. Right. Yeah. That's symbolic play.
So a bit of imagination.
Imagination, right. Or dressing up, or, all those things are imagination, pretend play. And then, of course, there's, even with kids who have adequate language, or we should say speech, they don't have the ability to converse.
Right.
Okay, so any of those are examples of communication deficits. We need at least one symptom in that area. Okay. And finally, the last section is stereotypic and repetitive behaviors, which we also refer to as self-stimulatory behaviors, or stereotypy. And these could be a different, million different things. I listed a few, sort of having routines that are difficult to break. Things have to be a certain way. Preoccupation. You've seen a lot of kids like preoccupied with one aspect of something. Intense focus on one thing where you can't really break the child off of that, or motor behaviors that are repetitive, like hand flapping or body rocking. And these have all been over time classified under one heading, which is the stereotypic repetitive behaviors. These are behaviors that don't have necessarily a function, or people don't understand why the child is doing this other than some intrinsic reason that we don't know. And so if you have 2 in the social deficit area and 1 in communication, 1 in stereotypic repetitive behaviors, that's just 4.
Right.
And you need a total of 6. Okay. So 2 additional symptoms in one of these 3 areas. And as I said, they all have to have become evident before the age of 3.
Right.
And if you have 6 symptoms, then you have a diagnosis of autistic disorder. That's the current process. Okay?
And so this is part of the reason why 2 children with autism could look so vastly different.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Because somebody could have 5 from communication and 1 from 2 from social and 1 from repetitive, and they qualify for an autism diagnosis. But somebody else could have 2 from the social.
That's right.
8 from the repetitive. That's right. And 1 from language, and they still have the same diagnosis.
Absolutely. And also each of the symptoms that a child might have might be slightly deficient or extremely.
Right.
So in other words, a child might have delays in language, but they're not as severe as another child who has very significant delays. And up to this point, you're not really scoring them on a sort of qualitative measure. It's just, do they have a delay or not?
Right.
So yeah, that is exactly why there are so many different kids, and they all kind of fit under this thing. And it's actually interesting that you say that, because I think the goal for DSM-4 was to help sort of subdivide the kids. Right. And that's why they had the different diagnoses. They had the autistic disorder, which is the one we went through.
Right.
And then they had Asperger's and pdd-nos, which we're going to go through now.
Okay, great.
So Asperger's, and this is all current stuff, DSM-4, required that you would have 2 in the area of social deficits, again, like autism, and that you would have 1 in the sort of stereotypical repetitive behavior area and none in the communication deficit area. Okay. And so this would separate, the intention was that this would separate those kids out who have appropriate language skills or communication skills, but they still have some, delays or deficits in social behavior, and oftentimes they would also have some kind of adherence to routines or those types. And that's what we would classify as Asperger's. I never really liked the Asperger's diagnosis ever. It just didn't really fit the kids. Right. And the reason for that is that I think Asperger's children right now, the concept is that they don't have any language delay. And I think that kids with Asperger's do have a delay in social language, sort of pragmatic language, a very advanced abstract language. But, so this was how you diagnosed Asperger's, essentially, is that you weren't really looking at communication, you were looking more at social behavior.
And one of the things I've heard from parents that they felt was unjust about the Asperger diagnosis is that people tended to generalize and say, oh, it's a lesser version of autism. I think a lot of us look at it that way, and yet there's the possibility that there's somebody whose deficits in those areas are so extreme that it's a very, profound form of autism, but it's just different areas.
I wouldn't, if you're diagnosed incorrectly, at any point that you place an individual with Asperger's and an individual with autism or autistic disorder next to each other, the child with autistic disorder is always going to be more severe and profound. Okay. But what happens, which was kind of unfair for the families who have children with Asperger's, was that the deficits in Asperger's don't appear until a little bit later. So for instance, one of the things that we're looking at for 2- and 3-year-old, 4-year-old is mostly communication. Yeah. And because these children, Asperger's kids, tend to be very intelligent, they kind of overcompensate for the social delays. The social delays don't become really all that evident until maybe 5, 6. So often the Asperger's kids are diagnosed later. Yeah. And also, up till now, there hasn't been good funding for Asperger's, whereas, in the California, for instance, regional center system, you don't get any funding from the regional centers if you have a diagnosis of Asperger's, whereas you do if you have a diagnosis of autism.
Yeah.
So, and so basically it was a difficult situation. My Asperger's kids are the ones that I worry about the most, actually, because of the fact that the assumption is they're higher functioning, they don't get the level of support they should.
Okay, good
So
point.
that's one of the reasons I'm happy about the new changes, and you'll see, because it kind of just folds Asperger's into the whole spectrum.
Okay. And then we're left with pdd-nos.
pdd-nos, which stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified.
You know what parents say it stands for, though?
No.
They say pediatrician didn't diagnose.
Oh,
but
that's
what
great.
PDD stands for.
That's perfect. I didn't know. I'd never heard that.
And then there's something for the NOS as well, but I think it's not something we can say on TV.
Yeah. I just think it's nonsense. It's like, and we have this in mental disorders. You have it, it's not just with autism, but you have it across a few other disorders as well, where it's kind of like the catch-all category.
Yep.
It's like, okay, this is the child who has not 6 symptoms, but 5.
Right.
Okay, where do I put him?
Right.
He definitely has 5 deficits or 4 deficits that have to be dealt with. So we put him in the pdd-nos category and say, okay, that means he's higher functioning. He's less delayed, or he has fewer symptoms to deal with.
Right.
And that was the kids with pdd-nos, I think, were completely treated unfairly, because everyone kind of expected these kids to just do fine.
Right.
I mean, I had over the years, many situations where I had to go to court for kids or really argue the fact that they needed services despite their pdd-nos diagnosis.
Because funding sources frequently go, so you have maybe 5, not the 6, and or maybe 2 of them aren't from the one area that they need to be from social.
Exactly.
So you could actually have 7, but if they weren't 2 from the social, you don't fit the diagnosis. So there you are with the pediatrician saying to you, oh, your child has deficits, good luck with that, there's no funding.
Exactly.
Horrifying.
For instance, I would have a child where they would have every single stereotypic behavior that could exist, and delays in communication, and because they had just one symptom is the social, which would be just aberrant social behavior, and you'd look at that child and say, oh my gosh, he's more severe, and I can't diagnose him. So these were some of the problems that we had.
Hopefully addressed in the DSM-V.
Yes, hopefully addressed now. I think they will be, actually. I like it. As I've said before, we'll see how it impacts society, but I do like the new criteria.
So we're going to delve into the DSM-V now. I think we should take a short break.
Okay.
We'll let you take a drink and let you guys ask questions about anything that we've discussed so far, and then we'll continue on with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh breaking down the new DSM-V autism criteria. Stick with us. Welcome back to Autism Live and Ask Dr. Doreen. We have with us in the studio right now Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, truly a visionary in the field of autism, and I would argue the greatest autism expert.
Thank you.
You have the experience and have had you don't look like you could possibly be old enough to have had the experience that you have, but you have. And working with children and really being at the forefront of getting help, both clinically, but also making sure that the legislation happens that will help the families.
Oh yeah, things have improved quite a bit since I started. But yeah, I mean, I think it's been my puzzle my whole life. Like, I've been trying to figure it out my whole life. So the more we know, the better, of course.
Well, and it helps me to sleep at night to know that great minds like yourself are working on this, working on, and you always take into consideration, how do we get this to the family? How do we trickle this down to the family? Because they're the important part of this. I always hear you saying that, and I appreciate that greatly.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
And so today we're talking about the DSM-V.
DSM-V.
We just went through the DSM-4 and talked about what the current status is, and now you're going to start to tell us what some of the differences are.
Right. So what we'll do is we'll talk first about, because it's quite different.
Okay.
So we're going to start with just like a definition of the DSM-5 criteria now, and then we'll just sort of target the differences.
Okay.
So first of all, as I said, it's called autism spectrum disorder now, which I'm glad, because for many years people were just referring to ASD, and that wasn't a term that even existed.
Funny.
even the chapter wasn't called ASD, and I was like, where are people getting this from? So
yeah, it sort of became the PC term because there was such the battle between is the child autistic or does the child have autism?
Right.
And different people feel different ways about it, so everybody started saying ASD.
Right.
Because nobody could argue with that.
Right.
But so now it flows with it.
Now it flows with it, and so it starts with the first criteria, I guess, which they call criterion A, and this, there's a lot of text on the screen here, but basically this is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across contexts, and it can't be accounted for by general developmental delays, and manifested by all three of the following.
Okay.
So there's two things here. One is we're no longer saying you have to have like X number of the following. We're saying you have to have all of the ones that are listed on this page. And the purpose for this is that they've joined communication and social. Now, I've said for years and years, obviously, how can you not have a social delay if you have a communication delay?
Right.
There's almost no way, right? I mean, when you have a communication delay, unless you're hearing impaired, you will have a social delay.
Right.
And that's what happens. I mean, how can you socialize if you can't vocalize or communicate?
Right, makes sense.
So it makes a lot of sense that they've joined it. So the very first thing is they've joined communication and social, and these are the things they want you to have. The deficits in social emotional reciprocity, we had that was kind of the empathy portion, which ranges from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation, so that's kind of through reduced sharing of interests, emotions, and affect, and response to total lack of initiation of social interactions. So that basically says the whole array, if you have a mild social deficit or if you have a very significant social deficit, that's number one. You got it. That you have that point. But you also have to have deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors like used for social interaction. Things like poor integration of verbal and nonverbal communication. This is kind of like, standing very, very close to people and talking to them, not giving eye contact, through abnormalities in eye contact, gestures, understanding gestures, exactly. Body language as a whole, or deficits in understanding and the use of nonverbal communication, all the way to a lack of facial expression or gesture. So that means sort of doesn't matter how severe, but if you are not able to have those, if you don't have those non-verbal communicative behaviors, whether they're mild or severe, then you classify. That'll be point 2. You have that.
Okay.
Third area is deficits in developing and maintaining relationships appropriate to developmental level, ranging from all the way from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit the different social contexts, all the way through difficulties in sharing imaginative play, making friends to an apparent absence of interest in people. So this is, again, is a sort of a broad array. So it's kind of like, oh, I have a hard time making friends, or I just have absolute isolation, no contact at all with people.
Right.
And so for us as people who've been diagnosing, these are not new words. These are all old words. They were part of the diagnosis before, but they weren't merged. Okay. What's happened now is they've merged it, and they've said, so you must have all 3 of these. Okay, so now let's look at what they are.
Can I ask one thing, though? Because what's initially scary to me as a parent is, you have to have all 3 of these, but within those 3, they give you such a broad target, and you just have to have one thing within that broad target, correct?
That's right.
Okay, great.
And if you really think about it, Shannon, these 3 are the ones that most of the kids would have before anyway, because remember, we used to have 2 in the social area?
Right.
And at least 1 in the communication area?
Right.
That's what they are.
Okay.
It's those 3 that everybody always had.
Okay.
So most of our kids will fall into one of these categories, or all 3 of them, actually. So just to be clear, the first one is just social emotional reciprocity.
Okay.
The second one is non-verbal communication.
Okay.
And the third one is developing and maintaining relationships. And these three are pretty commonly, checked off when you do diagnosis, even with the criteria right now.
So whether you before had a pdd-nos or you had Asperger or you had autism, chances are that, you've got a good chance
You're going to have these three.
Okay, great.
Because you might, for instance, if we look at it, a very mild case right now would have, for instance, back at the first category was, deficits in social emotional reciprocity, right? Let's say this child would have difficulty with back and forth conversation.
Okay.
They get hit number one.
Right.
Number two is, they also have a little bit of a difficulty understanding other people's gestures.
Okay.
Okay, and the third one would be, for instance, they don't make friends like other kids do.
Okay.
See how mild it is, but you would qualify.
You qualify. Okay, great.
And on the very severe end, obviously, completely isolated, no eye contact, so it works. So that's criterion A, and that's the most important that has to be present.
Okay.
Now, criterion B is where they deal with all the stereotypical stuff that used to exist also, remember? And so that's restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of the following. So they just want you to have two of the four that they've listed. Okay. And of the two would be, so here are just some of them: stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements, use of objects, and we've said this, sort of the kids who have, repetitive speech like echolalia, or they have motor movements like hand flapping or body rocking, all of that. Second one is excessive adherence to routines. Right? That's our kids who have rituals and patterns of, they just want things to be a certain way and they have a hard time. The third one is there too: highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Like really always having to kind of look at the detail of their toys or, all of those. And again, as I said, those three are very common language for us who've diagnosed, because those were the classifications that were under stereotypy before. That hasn't changed. These are just examples that were there. But they're saying you need to have two of these. Now look at the fourth one. The fourth one is awesome. It's brand new. I love it. Thank God they finally got it. Yeah. It's the very, very first time sensory comes into the diagnosis. We've never had sensory before. Hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. For instance, indifference to pain, heat, cold, or adverse response to specific sounds, textures, excessive smelling, touching, fascination. I am so happy that came in. Yes. Because all of my kids had some form of sensory, the majority of my kids had some form of sensory issue, and it just it wasn't classified. Right. So it was always important to treat that, but it wasn't something that would contribute to the child receiving a diagnosis. Now it does. Which is because exciting. In criterion B, you need two of the four. And so if let's say someone has repetitive speech and sensory issues, they'll qualify. Or if they have very, item 3, which is the highly restricted fixated interests and the excessive adherence, those to me are caused usually by anxiety. And a lot of my kids have anxiety, so they kind of do obsessive compulsive behaviors. Right. So for me, it's awesome because if I now have a child who has sensory issues and anxiety, which a lot of times the anxiety comes from the sensory dysregulation. Right. It's a pretty scary world if things are like too intrusive or too loud, it makes you anxious. Now I have that. If I have a child who has those two symptoms, that qualifies for criterion B. Okay, great. And that's terrific. So not to get confused, but criterion A was where we were looking at the social and communication. Right. Criterion B is where we were looking for the stereotypical repetitive. Okay, but that's got the added sensory component. Which is terrific. Wonderful. Yeah. Now we have two more. We have criterion C, which says that the symptoms must be present in early childhood. So in other words, that was the same as before. Remember, we had said they should be there before the age of 3. Right. Symptoms should be apparent. And criterion D is that the symptoms together limit and impair everyday functioning. That's not even necessary. I think they put that in there because, I don't know. I mean, it's funny because in the previous years, whenever I train interns and I'm trying to teach them how to diagnose, I've always told people, and I think we've even said it on this show, that nothing is considered a diagnosis or a disorder unless it impairs day-to-day functioning. I always give the example of, you know, somebody could go home and drink a bottle of scotch every night, and as long as their family is happy, they're functional, they go to work, they can balance their checkbook, everything's fine, they don't have a disorder.
Right.
You know, so the disorder only comes in when it has to do with limiting the individual's everyday functioning.
Right.
And so, you know, in school, when it comes to kids, or within the family structure, and when it comes to adults, it has to do with work.
Can I go back to C for a second?
Sure.
Emily, can you put that back up for a second? Because when we saw last summer and were able to comment, it seemed as though that this, in parentheses, is the new part of this. Is this, or was this in DSM-4 and I just didn't know it was there?
No, it's a clarification. I think what they're trying to say, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities. The reason for that is that often a parent who this is their first child won't really know what's appropriate or not appropriate, and therefore we only start to see a lot of the problems when the child enters, let's say, preschool.
Yeah.
And so what this is trying to say in the parentheses is that, you know, the child could have had these various symptoms, but because the parent was just not placing demands or was doing their best to try to just walk around the child and take care of the child, the child didn't really show these deficits, or perhaps the child was, you know, homeschooled or in an environment where it just didn't become evident.
Okay.
So this is something good. In other words, it basically says, okay, well, maybe the first person who saw it was the teacher and the child was now 4, which is very common, but that doesn't mean that the symptoms didn't exist before.
Because that sounds great, because I know at least one mom has asked that she has a 7-year-old that when he was getting diagnosed, they said, well, the symptoms weren't there before 3, but has huge social deficits that have become apparent in the last couple of years.
Right.
So he might qualify just because of that parenthetical. Is that possible?
Well, remember we were just talking about Asperger's,
and
we said that when the children have Asperger's, there's so much, their functioning level is higher, and so a lot of the things about Asperger's, like let's go look at even these. Now let's forget about Asperger's because Asperger's is gone now.
Right.
But let's talk about, for instance, the social deficits that we just went through, right? Let's say someone doesn't have, has, for instance, difficulty with nonverbal communicative behaviors, or deficits in maintaining relationships.
Right.
Okay, developing and maintaining relationships. That's a great one. That's number 3 under criterion A. That's something that doesn't even develop normally until after 3.
Right.
See, when you are 3 or even after 5. So when you're a 3-year-old, you don't have sustained relationships with peers. Every day someone else is your best friend. Right? We all know that. And it has to do with if they brought you candy or gave you their pencil.
Okay.
That's very normal. So if a child now is really having problems, and let's say they're 5, and their main area is just they can't develop relationships, well, that caveat in the parentheses sort of allows us as diagnosticians to say, okay, well, maybe it wasn't apparent before 3, but it wasn't something that would become apparent.
Right.
So it is now becoming apparent, and the child's 5. That doesn't mean that the earlier deficits weren't there, because there has to be some core cause.
Okay.
The good example of that, Shannon, is theory of mind, is the perspective taking stuff that we know so many of our kids have a problem with, yet perspective taking in normal kids doesn't really even develop until 4 or 5.
Okay.
So how would we say this is a core deficit that must be present before 3? No, an earlier version of it would have had to been present, but it just became apparent after 3.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's what that means.
Okay.
So now we have criterion A, B, C, and D. Okay, and if you remember, all of A, 2 of the symptoms of B, which is the restricted repetitive behaviors. The symptoms have to be there in early childhood, even if you can't see them right away. Okay. And they impair the child's everyday functioning.
Okay.
Great. That's it.
Okay.
That's the new diagnostic criteria. And I look at the key differences, and that's on the next slide. And so you notice that the 3 domains now become 2, whereas before it was social and communication and repetitive behaviors. Now it's only social communication and repetitive behaviors. Okay. Second change is that now we don't have categories anymore of autistic disorder, Asperger's, PDD, etc. Now we are just dimensional. It's one dimensional. It's like far end to, very excessive to not so excessive, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Another new change is that we now require 2 of the repetitive restrictive behaviors. Before 1 was enough.
Right. But there's the addition of the sensory, which is quite amazing and makes that much more palatable.
That's right, and that's an awesome addition. Yes. And the other 2 really good changes that are on the next slides are we have what are called specifiers and modifiers, which I'm going to go through in a sec.
Okay.
And we have level of severity, which I'm going to go through after that. Okay, so the next.
Should we take a break? Would you like to take a break before we do or you want to forge on?
Completely up to you.
Let's take a short break, and then we're going to come back to do the specifiers and modifiers and severity. So keep your questions coming. Right back more with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh after these messages. Welcome back to Autism Live and Ask Dr. Doreen. We have Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh here with us in the studio, and she is taking apart this DSM-5, the criteria for autism, and it's very exciting to see this all now and see what has changed. You've gone through the DSM-4 so we could see what the status was and some of the differences, and gone through the DSM-5, but now you're going to show us the modifiers and the levels.
That's right, and this is sort of a very key portion of the DSM-5 diagnosis. And so just to really quickly summarize with the DSM-5, we went through that there are 2 sections now. One is sort of the social communication, and in that you need to have all the symptoms that are listed, although it'll range from pretty severe to moderate to mild. And the second criteria is the repetitive stereotypical behaviors, and in there you have to have 2 of the symptoms. And then if it's before the age of 3 or early development and it causes problems in functioning or adaptive functioning, then you're good so far for the diagnosis. Now there's 2 other, so at this point you would basically have the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. What's more important is this is how they're helping us differentiate the kids who are so different from each other.
Okay.
Because you realize we're just kind of, that's why I don't think this is a bad thing, Shannon, because I think what they've done is they've kind of taken away those just random names or labels, put them all in one basket and said, okay, you can be extremely mild or extremely severe as long as you have these things. Now we're going to talk about how to give a better picture of each child. Okay. So with the new criteria, if the child meets the diagnosis of ASD, he's going to receive the diagnosis, and this is the first time ever anybody's even asking etiology. What's causing it? If we know that this is symptoms of autism due to, let's say, a genetic disorder like Rett syndrome or Fragile X, you're going to put it in here now. You're going to say ASD with Rett syndrome, ASD with Fragile X. Now what's really awesome about this, and it's funny because when you look at the diagnostic, the manual 5 and how the examples they gave, which is Rett syndrome and Fragile X, right? First of all, Rett syndrome, oh my gosh. Rett syndrome used to be one of the ASD, one of the pervasive developmental disorders before, and it is unbelievably rare. I actually don't know the exact prevalence of Rett syndrome, but in my lifetime, and I've been seeing kids for 30 years, more than 30 years, I've maybe diagnosed 3 kids with Rett syndrome, and it's a much more progressive and debilitating genetic disorder. So it's kind of now, but it does at some early stage, it can resemble autism symptoms. And Fragile X, of course, is a genetic pure genetic disorder, and again at some point early on will resemble the symptoms of autism. And those are the only two that they've listed as possible examples. But this is very exciting for me because there's, oh my gosh, so many other genetic disorders that resemble autism, and this is so important, like Angelman syndrome and so on. And I love the fact that we can easily put those children in, because up till now what would happen is if you were diagnosed with a genetic disorder, you were pulled out of autism and all your funding was shut off.
Oh, how
which
horrifying.
is horrible. Right, exactly. And because it's garbage. Kids who have, let's say, Angelman's or any of these other milder genetic syndromes will benefit tremendously from behavioral intervention, and it wasn't fair that they would be pulled out because someone has discovered their genetic issues.
What a disservice.
Yeah. So this is very good, and so you can put that in there now. This is very important. And of course, let me see, do I have it on the other pages? I think I do. Well, and the other very important, if I don't, I mean, I should just mention it here. The very cool thing here is this means you can also basically say that the child has other types of medical illnesses. So this is kind of important that you can start throwing these in, right? If you know that it has to be etiology, so it's kind of like pretty clear that this other thing is leading to these symptoms.
Okay.
That gives us a new in. Now the modifiers are kind of interesting as well. The modifiers indicate some other important factor. They're not the cause, but it is an important factor for diagnosticians or treatment providers to be aware of. For instance, with seizures, ASD with seizures, ASD with intellectual disabilities. Now this is kind of very, very important, that last one, because historically people had always thought of autism as, okay, so back in, I think it was DSM-3 maybe even, people were saying things like, oh, it's if you have a child with autism, they're also mentally retarded. They have mental retardation, and I fought that for years and years and years. Now what they're saying is if the child has mental retardation, you can put that in. So in other words, they're agreeing with the fact that the vast majority of our kids don't have it. So that's awesome. So that's another thing.
Very awesome.
Yeah. These are modifiers, so those are two other things. I have to kind of speed up, don't I? Because I'm almost done, actually. I'm almost done.
We'll take as much time as it takes.
Right. So then the other things that go in, again, on the specifiers and modifiers are things like early history. And these are awesome things. Like, you're giving so much more information on the diagnosis now than you ever did. Okay. So, for instance, age of perceived onset. Yeah. Before, you either had autistic disorder, or you had what was called childhood disintegrative disorder, which was for kids who regressed. None of us ever used childhood disintegrative disorder. It was just such a silly, contrast. This allows us to actually talk about the pattern of onset within the diagnosis. So, was there a loss of skills? When did it happen? And so you could be actually diagnosing kids as things like ASD with onset before 20 months and loss of words. Wow. Or ASD with onset before 32 months and loss of social skills. That is spectacular. Like, I love defining it this way. Or you could just simply say ASD with no clear onset and no loss. This is a child who just never progressed.
And, am I leaping too far? But to me, it seems like that will help in our ongoing struggle to phenotype autism. If this information is put in at diagnosis, and then we see and track the progress, it's going to help us down the road to be able to know what's effective for each one of those categories.
Right. It's going to be much, much more helpful, for sure, definitely, no question.
Yeah. Love that.
And so if you wanted to hear in this category, in the modifiers or specifiers, you can also say ASD Asperger's type. Okay. So in other words, what would have previously been diagnosed as Asperger's, now you can mention it here.
Great.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
So the specifiers and modifiers are terrific. They really
are. For everybody.
Absolutely. They're wonderful. And finally, the last new addition is the level of severity. Now, the level of severity essentially gives you 3 levels, and that's level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 means the child requires support. Level 2 means the child requires, or the adult requires substantial support. And level 3 means requires very substantial support. And we've given a few examples within social communication, if someone and restricted behaviors. So, if you need some support. That means in the area of social communication, without support, there would be some significant deficits in social communication. That's the mildest. But look at level 3, if you require very substantial support, that means really if you look at this individual's social communication, it's pretty much non-existent, very minimal social communication. Or if you look at the restricted behaviors, a mild version might be significant interference in at least one context. In other words, this person is self-stimulating, but only in school. Whereas a level 3 child might have constant self-stimulatory behavior in daily life. So this is where it gives you the ability to differentiate the severity level.
So forgive me for asking what's probably a ridiculous question, but is this kind of mimicking, because we use terms like high functioning and profoundly affected?
Yes.
So instead we're going to say level 1, level 2, and level 3?
Right, it is, and it's because of it absolutely. I mean, the high functioning, low functioning type thing will be kind of determined by these.
Okay.
Because really, the more impacted, the lower functioning a person is considered, then the more support they need, obviously. Right. So that they would be a level 3.
Okay.
And I think this is also very critical because keep in mind we don't have Asperger's and PDD anymore.
Right.
So this is sort of to differentiate those kids perhaps that have a higher, like less deficit would be level 1.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's pretty good. I like the levels of severity.
Okay.
Now, and that's the diagnostic criteria. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, which will also impact some people's lives, which I think is important, is that a new diagnosis that came in is coming into the DSM is called social communication disorder. That's the next slide. I just put this in because this is a brand new thing I haven't seen before. And social communication disorder it's a rule-out diagnosis for kids. If I want to diagnose a child with ASD now, I just need to make sure that it isn't social communication disorder. And this means this is the individual who has some impairment in pragmatic use of language, so abstract social language. And they have a difficulty in the social use of verbal and nonverbal communication. So in other words, they have a hard time with relationships. And it can't be explained by low IQ or word structure or grammar problems. And the symptoms. So this is that scary new diagnosis where some kids may fall into this who used to be Asperger's.
Right.
And they might fall into this now. And if they do fall into this is not a funded disorder. Right? It's not part of the ASD.
Okay, so this is the scary part.
This is the one that we have to be cautious about. For me, it's a very clear difference if a child has social communication problems versus a child who has ASD. And that's just very clear for me. First of all, I don't think that you can look at these social communication stuff when you're looking at really young kids.
Right. Because
a lot of the social communication stuff comes up later in life.
Okay.
But this is the one that scares me and it really has nothing to do with the ASD diagnosis. It's this new one, which I fear a little bit because, it says academic achievement, when those types of things start hitting our kids and a diagnosis comes in that says this is what your kid has, it's not going to lead directly to behavioral interventions. That's a problem.
Okay, that is a problem.
So really the main clinical implications, I guess, things that we need to think about and see how they roll out are now, and this is, by the way, something else that's kind of new, which is very important. And I said this, I criticized so many other people diagnosing, because often you would see a diagnosis of autism on the first, and then you would also see a diagnosis of ADHD. A lot of parents would tell me, my child was diagnosed with autism and attention deficit, and I'd say, well, the diagnostician messed up. You're not allowed to do that.
Okay.
It was not allowed. You could not diagnose ADHD with autism because autism was considered much more pervasive and severe. And it would be kind of like diagnosing someone with like pneumonia and bronchitis.
Okay.
It wouldn't work. Now you're allowed to. Now they're
Okay.
seeing them as two separate things, and they're saying, okay, you can say ADHD and ASD.
Okay.
So this is a big, big, big new thing.
Okay.
And of course now you realize all those gold standard assessments, the ADOS, all that is
Right.
gone now. They have to redo everything.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're working on redoing all those new assessments. And I think the main implication, or the biggest thing that we'll have to see how it rolls out, is just really how it will help or hinder services and funding.
The funding.
Yeah.
Which
Those
is
are the
always,
things.
unfortunately, because it shouldn't be.
Absolutely. And we
But
just
it's
have to be
always the
very
cornerstone.
careful.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to be careful. And you know, there's, even to this day, I don't think there are too many people that really understand autism very well, and so it's very important that people who are diagnosing really understand how to do this correctly.
And is there any sort of training that they will
Not existing. Well, I mean, you could most likely in a year or so there will be some continuing education courses on diagnostics, but they won't be just autism. You know, you'll go to a 2-hour class and it'll review every change that's in the DSM-V.
So I guess one of my huge takeaways with this, and something we say a lot here, when you're going to do an assessment, make sure that it's the top quality assessment. If you're going to invest the time and the money, make sure it's top quality assessment. And I always like to advise that whoever is doing the assessment is not tied to who holds the purse strings.
That's very, very true. That's right. And sometimes we would have here in California, the regional centers would do their own assessments, and then it would go one way or another. Yeah, there's a conflict of interest there.
Yeah.
I guess I would suggest to parents, you know, if you have I'm not going to go back and re-diagnose my kids. Like this is something important. Like right now, if you have a child with autism or Asperger's or whatever it is, unless there's some benefit to your child in terms of funding, I would just leave it alone. None of us
grandfathered in, right?
Yeah. Well, what's going to happen is, I assume, with the insurance companies, they're going to change your diagnosis to ASD. Then the next round where you are up for funding again, we're going to have to provide new diagnoses.
Okay.
But it's not like you're going to go, none of us are going to go, I have 2,000 kids, I'm not going to go back and re-diagnose everyone, but I will when their insurance stuff comes up or their funding, if the funding questions, that'll be a few years.
Okay.
If you now get a child, so I would just leave it alone and not get too disturbed about it, because really this is just for your services and funding. If you have a child who right now is going into diagnosis and the clinician provides a diagnosis or doesn't, then I would really probably try to see a specialist or an expert, because really it's, you know, that's important. It's just I only worry about the high level kids who need intervention, who may now fall into that social communication disorder category, and that would be a little upsetting, because those are the kids that really do need help.
Okay.